Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Sage 300 CRE Basic Report Designer Session 1. This is going to cover just some basic features within the software and some theory type stuff too, getting used to your data. Before we get started, I want to remind you that there are two handouts attached to the GoToWebinar meeting invite. One is a copy of the PowerPoint that we're going to be reviewing, and the other is the actual training material in a PDF format. There are approximately 28 pages in that handout that are going to cover all the screenshots that we're going to go through once we're inside the software. So if you have a minute to go ahead and get that printed out, then you can follow along with us as we go through the session, and you can take notes right in or on that document, which will be pretty helpful once you get in and start modifying or creating your own report designs. All right, so again, my name is Jeanette, and I'll be your instructor for today. This is session 1 of 2 sessions. This is going to cover, again, some kind of an overview of what we're going to, some of the features that we have inside the report designer. This is the Sage report designer. And then we're going to take a look at data structure, because one of the important things to be successful with the Timberline report writer is to understand how your data is stored and what kind of information you can pull out of it and from where. So we're going to spend some time talking about the data structure. We're also going to spend some time talking about report planning. Again, to be successful with the whole report writing, even if you're doing Crystal, it's true in both places, or if you're doing Inquiry Designer, you need to have a plan for the end result. So something that has either been drawn out on paper, or you've been given a list of fields that someone in your company wants on the report. You need something that you can work from or start from to get the report pulled together. Lastly, we're going to get into the design basics, and at this point we're going to jump into the software and we're going to design a simple accounts payable report. And as we do that, we'll be talking about all the different areas within the software or the application for pulling a report together. Right, so features. The user-friendly design screen. To me, the report designer RD inside Sage is a lot more friendly, I think, than the Crystal report writer. And once you design a couple of them, you'll see what I'm talking about. And when we get into the software, you'll see what I'm talking about as well. It's pretty much all on one main screen, and it just seems you're actually able to see basically what the report's going to look like as you build the design. Now, you can have as many designs as you want. You can create as many designs. They have a .rpt extension on the end of them when you save them. You can also modify designs supplied by Sage. Now, what I would recommend for those is that you copy the Sage design to a new name and then modify that new design, so that if you ever have to restore or reinstall your Sage software, you don't want the install to overwrite customization that you've done to the standard Sage report designs. Now, these reports can have a lot of detail. We can go down to the transaction level to get information, or we can pull summary information, or we can pull detail and tell it within the report design to summarize. So we've got quite a few options there as to how much or how little information you want to see on that report. We can build formulas. Now, these formulas can either be public formulas that can be accessible in all different types of reports, or even within the software itself where it needs a format to run, or we can save the formulas inside the report design itself, which means that that formula cannot be used anywhere else in the system or in any other design because it's stored specifically within that particular custom report design. We can do fonts. We can change font sizes. In some cases, we can pull in some color. What you're going to see, though, with the RD design is that this is a very basic report writer. It doesn't have all the fancy bells and whistles that Crystal has. So you will not be able to draw boxes or do shading. You can draw some lines using the dashes or the underline key on your keyboard. So we can get some of that into the report. But again, the fancy stuff that you're used to seeing in Crystal you may not see that in RD. Now, lastly, we can assign security. So if you want to put security on the design itself so no one else can go in and change it, we can do that. All right, starting on page 1 of the PDF handout for the training documentation, we're going to start on page 1 here, and we're going to talk now about the data structure. And so those of you that have been with Sage for a while, you already know that Sage stores the data in a company folder. So you have an overall folder that stores all the files that you process with the accounting software. Within that folder are a set of files. And the files that you're going to be focusing on for your report writing are the master files and the transaction files. So in your handout on page 1, it talks about the 3 different types of transaction files and the master files. So the transaction files themselves, this is where all the detail is stored. So we're looking at new, which is the unposted transactions, current, which are the posted, and history, which are the archived. So basically, you're able to report on any transactions that you have entered into Sage using any of those 3 files. And then your master file is where all the static information comes from. So things like vendor ID, vendor name, address, phone numbers, employee names, filing statuses, those types of things. Those are considered static information, as well as you're going to have fields in there for accumulated totals. So like job-to-date cost, job-to-date estimate, job-to-date dollars paid. That type of information will be in the master file. And sometimes it's just easier to pull master file accumulations than to try to sort through a bunch of transactions. So again, it depends on who is asking for the report, what kind of information they want to see on this report, whether you're going to pull this from the master or one of the transaction files. Now, inside those files, we have records. And this is another concept that you need to become familiar with. When you're looking at, let's say, a payroll master file, or actually let's use job cost as an example. You're looking at the job cost master file. Within that file, you have records for the job itself, for extras if you're using extras, for cost codes, and for categories. So you're going to have multiple records within that master file, and you need to determine when you're pulling the report together where the information, which one of those records that information is going to come from. So even though we say master, within that master, we may be talking about quite a few different record types that we're going to pull information from. Now, we have a concept here in Sage called data dictionary. So the data dictionary is your reference for everything that's going to be stored in each of those record types. So one of the things that I would recommend is that you go into the software when you start to design initially start designing your reports, is that you go into get over here, get into RD for us for a second. Under Tools, we have an option here called Available Fields. Now I've jumped to page 2. This is at the top of page 2 in your handout. This gives you a list here in alphabetical order by application. And then underneath that application name, you're going to see all of the different records that are stored within the accounts payable set of files. So when we're talking about like invoices, so these could be transactions, they could be just the specific record. You know, when you enter an invoice in AP, you enter an invoice record, then you enter a distribution record, and each of these two things has different fields available to them. So again, we're looking for, here's the vendor record, we're looking for the records that we think we're going to include in our job costs, or excuse me, in our AP report. Or we're scrolling down, and actually you can type on your keyboard. I can get to the J's here. So here are the different records that we just talked about for job costs. There's the job, the extra, the cost code, the category. So again, you're trying to determine which of these records you need for your report. So if we're going to do let's say we're going to do this off the invoice record, we want to see it, and we might want to see what's on the vendor record. When you click on that record, it moves it over here to the record selected area. And then when you click OK, it brings up a print selection screen. If you're doing anything outside of Sage that's connecting with Sage, you want to go ahead and check this box to include the ODBC reporting so that you can see what the internal field names are. And then here I'm just going to do a print preview so that you can see what we're looking at here. Let me zoom in a bit on this. Okay. All right, so these are listed in, they're listed in order by what the screen looks like when you're inside the application. So as an example here, we're looking at the invoice record. So it's displaying first the vendor, the invoice, the description, the amount. These are things kind of in order by how it displays. And it'll be the same if I go down and look at the vendor record here. It's grouped by the screen inside Setup Vendor. So here's where we're seeing the vendor, the name, the address information, and that. So all of this is what you would see on that first screen. So in this first column, we're seeing the name. Then this internal name, this is for ODBC. So if you're interfacing with maybe with Crystal, these would be the names of the fields inside Crystal. Then you've got a field type. So this tells you whether it's alpha, whether it's numeric, whether it's a bullet. And then you've got a length. So this shows you how wide this field can be. Code, that's an internal thing. Replaceable, this is something you need to look at. Again, if you are interfacing with something outside of Sage, this lets you know if you're able to replace the values in these fields through ODBC. If there's no check mark or X here, you cannot replace that field with ODBC. And then down below here, we've got special values. So if you have a field that has predetermined values, they will be listed here. So like the vendor type. These are the different types that you can select when you're setting up a vendor. Now, at the end of the printout, we need to talk about keys or indexes. At the end of each of these printouts, you're going to see an area called Standard Orders. Your report will always print by whatever is in Standard Order 1. So this tells me that if I run a report off the vendor master file, it's going to print in vendor ID order. There's a secondary key called name. And so I could, when I design my report, I could switch the order and have it print by name instead. So I don't have to design a custom sort. I can use this secondary key as part of my design. Now, if I come back up here and let's look at the invoice record, there's a few more fields here. All right, so the standard order for the invoice record is vendor invoice. There are some sub or secondary indexes that I can select from if I want to, and those are listed underneath. And in parentheses, underneath each line here, it's showing me what fields it's going to use to find that information. And that's really what a key or an index does. It's like an address to where this record exists inside the file, so that instead of having to sort through every single record in the file when you run the report, it looks at this index or this address and boom, it goes right to that record. Okay. Without these standard orders, these reports would take forever to run and it would be worthless. Okay, so this is a huge important thing here to understand, that each one of these records has a standard order, at least one. Okay, so this is what we just talked about then, the key. So it gives the software an address to where this record resides. Okay. And we just talked about this as well. So the primary key, that's always number one, and then alternate keys are listed below if there are any. So that again, you don't have to design a custom sort to get the record to get the report in a different order. If one of those alternate keys already exists, you should use it instead. And I'll show you when we get in the software where this comes into play. All right, on page 3 at the bottom, the relationships, record relationships. This is another concept that if you're new to Report Writer, you need to kind of remember. So you really have 3 record relationships that you need to be aware of. One-to-one means one record out of one record is related to only one record of another record type. So it's kind of hard to say, but the example I've given you here is invoice to vendor. A single invoice is only going to be associated with one vendor. So that is a one-to-one relationship versus the relationship on the top, one-to-many, where a vendor is going to have multiple invoices. Now, the reason that you'll need to be aware of this relationship is when you're designing the report and you may want to either condition or summarize information, you need to recognize that inside that vendor master file, there are going to be multiple invoices for that vendor. And so what we're going to take advantage of is something called a print control to determine how often that record gets accumulated or printed. All right, so one-to-one is big, one-to-many is big, and also none or no relationship is big. Because there are going to be times when you're going to try to design a report and you've pulled records into this report to get the information, and as you start to build it, the system is going to tell you, hey, I can't bring that information in onto this report because I don't have any kind of relationship from this record to the main record in the report. And next week when we do our advanced session, we're going to talk about a function formula that will help you with that, where you can actually build in a formula, you can build a relationship between records that don't actually have a relationship, which means there's not, the information like the example I gave to you here, a check record does not have an invoice number field in it. So there's no relationship there. I can run a report using the check records, but I can't pull invoice information into that report because invoice number does not exist within the check record. Right, so these three primary, one-to-one, one-to-many, or none. Okay, report planning. This is on page 4. From past experience, just sitting down to the computer without some type of a plan to get started, you're doomed for failure because you don't know what this report, whoever is asked for it, they're not telling you how they want to use it and what they want on the report. So in your handout on page 4, I've broken it out a little bit further than what's on the screen in the PowerPoint. So the first thing there, purpose. Who or what is this report going to be used for? You need to have that as part of your plan. And then who needs it? So who's the audience for this report? One person may be asking for it, but there may be others within the company that are going to use it as well. So that those first two, the purpose of it and who's going to be using it, are important. And then from there, you're going to build something, and I've got actually, in the next few pages, I've got a sample of what you could use to draw this out before you sit down in the software. So I've broken it out into the 3 parts of the report. So first is header. So what do they want to see at the top? Meaning, what's the title to this report? Then in the body, what kind of information do they want to see in the body of the report when it prints? So are they looking for detail? Are they looking for summary lines? Have them or have you talk with them and draw out how they want that actually to look. And then footer, do they need something to print at the bottom of each page? Now, once you have that information, especially the body, then you can start determining which records you're going to need to get the information out for the report. So, and we're going to do a sample here in just a minute, and you'll understand that a little bit better. But as an example, if all they're asking for is information off the vendor master, name, address, phone number, then all you need is the vendor master. And you should write down the fields that you're going to actually need to do the report. Now, if this report uses multiple records, meaning I'm going to pull some information from the master file, but I'm also going to pull some information from the transaction file, you need to decide then between those 2 records, which one is going to be what we call the processing record or the driving record of the report, which means it controls how much information is going to print on this report. So as an example, we'll stick with AP. Maybe we've pulled the vendor master and the invoice transaction into the report design. If I go with invoice as the primary or driving record, which it will choose that, the system will choose whichever record has the most detail, and it assumes that's the one that you want. So it's going to pick invoice as my driving record. And that means that any vendor that does not have an invoice in the system yet will not show up on the report. No invoice, no vendor. Now, if I want to see all the vendors, regardless of whether they have invoices or not, then I need to change the driving record or the processing record to be vendor. Then it will print all my vendors along with invoices for each of the vendors that have them. So processing record is important because it determines which record is going to run this report when you print it. Sort order. Again, it's going to default to the primary key or sort order number 1 for the driving record. So whichever you choose as that driving record is going to determine the sort order. Now, when we get into the software, I'm going to show you how you can customize that sort order if you need it to print in a different way. Some additional other considerations, conditions. If we don't put any conditions on the report, then every single transaction or master file record is going to print on the report. Is that what you really want, or are you trying to condition it down? Maybe all you want to see are suppliers in AP, or maybe all you want are job numbers that are open. You don't want the closed jobs to print. So we can assign conditions to the report that will filter out the information that you want. Now, if you have planned this report out and you're looking through all the record types that you've selected, you printed out the data dictionary, and you don't see a field for something that you need in the report, we can create a formula for that. As long as we have all the pieces that we need to come up with the value, then we can create a formula. And we're gonna look at a simple formula today, but more advanced next week. And then any totals. If you want a report total, we need to assign that. If you need subtotals within the report, we can assign those as well. Back here. Okay, so on pages 5 and 6 in your handout. On page 5, I've given you a blank, kind of a layout worksheet, and I've only given you 5 columns here. But you might want to, recreate this for yourself and give yourself a few more. Maybe do it on a landscape instead of portrait. But I've given you an area to write out the title, define what you want in columns 1 through 5, put headings in headings across the top, and then draw out how you want that information to print. I've given you some lines where you can put, dollar signs or values in, and then whether or not you want subtotals, and then whether you want a grand total. Once you have the top part of that filled out, then I've given you a space to write in the required records, what's going to be the driving record, the sort, the condition, formulas. We can also do page break and line spacing. So if you look at page 6, I have filled one out. So I'm looking at an open invoice register, and I've got descriptions there for columns 1 through 5 of invoice number, description, amount paid, and balance. I've also filled in that I want the vendor ID and their name, and then I want some address information to print. And then I've kind of given myself a sample here where I'm showing an invoice number, that's the 12345, the description, the amount, and the balance. And then I want it to total by vendor. I want a subtotal by vendor, and then I want a grand total at the bottom. So my required records are vendor and invoice. My driving record is going to be invoice. I don't want to see vendors that I haven't received an invoice from yet. My sort order, I'm going to sort this by vendor name, and then within each vendor name, I want it sorted by invoice number. For conditions, I only want subcontract vendors to print. The formula, we don't have a balance field inside the vendor or the invoice record. So we're going to create a formula that says take the invoice amount minus the amount paid. We have those two fields on the invoice record. And that formula will give us the balance. And then I'm going to tell it I want it to page break by vendor. So I want each vendor to have their own page, and I'm going to do single spacing. So now with this in front of me, I can sit down and at my computer and go into RD, and I can quickly design a report just off this single sheet of paper. Now, before we go into the software, I just want to point out I've got, let's see, where did I put in your handout there should be a formula page, and if there's not, there will be one in next week's session. Yeah, it's not in the session one. I just want to point out the different types of formulas that we can pull into our design before we jump in the software. All right, so public formulas, these are the formulas that are created by you that can be used anywhere in the software. It doesn't have to be in the report design. Okay, so you might have created some stuff outside of RD, maybe in one of the applications. You have access to those public formulas inside Report Designer. That's different than an application formula. Application formulas are hard-coded. Sage maintains them. You cannot change them, but you can copy them to a new name in the public formula area, and then you can modify them. And again, they can be used wherever the software can use a formula. Now, the design formulas are the ones that we create inside of a report design, and we give it a name, and then it's used within that report design. These designs can also be copied out to the public formula. So if you have a formula in a report that you want to use in another report design or somewhere else in the software, pull that formula up inside the report design and copy it to a public formula, and then you'll be able to use it wherever else you need it. Lastly, we have something called quick formulas, and these, again, are created and stored within the design, but they're specific to a column within the design. You won't be able to give it a name, and you can't copy it or use it anywhere else other than where you've designed it right specifically in a column. All right, design basics. We're going to jump into the software now, and we're going to take a look quite a few areas. We're going to look at some default options that you have available to you that can be pulled in on all your designs. Then we're going to go in, we're going to actually use the setup on page 6. We're going to actually create that report. We're going to talk about the header and the footer. We're going to add fields into the body of the report. We're actually going to do a whole bunch of stuff in there so that you can see how to get the information onto or into the body, and then how you can manipulate it. We're going to look at selecting the processing record and modifying the sort order if we need. We're going to look at some display options. We're going to look at these briefly. We're going to go into more detail next week in the advanced session. Okay, so let me jump out here. And let's go back into report design. All right, so we're on page 7 now in your handout. And what we're looking at here is under, firstly under Tools, Customize. We're going to look at these two areas here first, and we're going to look at the extra tabs that there are when you're inside RD. Now, if you're outside of Report Designer, you just have this row of tabs: General, Status, Toolbar, Remote Print, and Appearance. What we're going to talk about are the tabs back here, starting with Preferences. Okay, and that's at the bottom of page 7. So here is your page heading option. So always use auto page heading means that it's always going to pull in a heading at the top. Your other choices are to prompt for one or to never use one. I don't think I've ever talked to anyone that uses either of these. Leave this at always use. We can make some modifications to the heading as we need. Your column headings, initial caps for the text. You can change that to all caps or even turn off the headings. Your default negative format, it defaults to put the minus sign on the end. If you're doing some designs and you're interfacing to Excel, you're going to want to change this to put the minus sign in the front. And you can do this on a report by report basis. So this is just setting up the default that's going to happen when we create our designs. Once we have the design created, we can actually make changes to any of these areas with it specific to that report design. So the checkboxes below, you can ask, or it defaults to give you a warning when you delete a column. So we're going to leave that on. So if I delete a field or a column out of a report, it's going to ask me, are you sure that's what you want to do? And I can say yes. If you want it to prompt you to enter design notes, you can put a check mark here, or give a warning if you change a font. And then this one, field list expands design window. That means when you go back in and open up an existing design, the field list for the driving record will automatically come up on the screen. Now we can turn that on, so you may want to leave that off for now. And if you decide later you want it to automatically pop in there, you can come in here and check this list or check this field. Okay. Now the descriptions of those are on the top of page 8. Colors tab here. You can set foreground and background colors, but you need to be aware. See the note at the bottom of page 8. This is only for display in Report Designer. This has nothing to do with how this is going to print. And we're going to be looking at that as far as printing. It's in a different area within the report design. So this colors area is just for the display inside RD. Okay. Most people do not change that. All right, totals is on page 9. So this is the default. You're going to get a single asterisk next to a total line. It defaults to drop the total if only one group prints, which means if I've only got one invoice for a vendor and I've told it to subtotal by vendor, and there's only one, it's not going to repeat that same amount for me twice. It's going to drop that total because there's only one record that prints. When the total prints include higher totals, which means it's going to subtotal down the page. So all the totals it's from the top down. Okay. And you also have an option here to put your grand totals or report totals on a new page. So if you want it to roll up and print those totals separately, you can. The spacing is going to default to double. So we're going to leave that. We can control spacing on a report by report basis. The automatically create totals, I would leave that unchecked. We have an area that we're going to define what totals we want. If you check this box, it will automatically create total lines on your report, and that might be confusing. So I would leave this unchecked, and then we're going to assign totals within the design itself. Page heading is on page 10. So the default here is to print company name, page number, and record security. I would uncheck that. I'm going to uncheck it for myself. This is a line that won't mean anything to anybody. It can be confusing, and you usually turn it off anyway when you set the total, or excuse me, when you set the title of the report. If you want to see the design name print up in the heading, you can check that. So if people want to know, well, what report design was used to create this, if you check that, it'll pull that at the top of the report. The output file name, if you want to have it put the name of the PDF file or the print file, you can include that up in the heading, as well as the operator, the report date, and the system date. And then here over on the other side, this is where you can define the format for those two dates, and it defaults to month, day, year with dashes. The view, the default is normal, which means it's going to be a white screen like you see right here, and then the fields are going to show up in black. So that's what's considered normal. You'll see the fields going across the screen, black and white. There are three other views that we're going to be talking about when we get into setting up the design. One is called print controls, and it determines, what print controls determines is how often a value is going to print when you run the report. It will change the color of the fields on the screen depending on what you select as far as a print control. The suppressed areas, we can block areas out where if there's no value, it will suppress the blank space that it would have normally left when you run the report. The conditional print area, again, this will change the fields into different colors if you're using it. This is where you can assign conditional formulas to a specific field on the report. That's different than assigning a condition to the overall report. So there may be situations where you need to say only print in this field if a certain criteria is met. And then you have an option to check a box to leave it blank if there's nothing there, or suppress the space if it doesn't meet the condition. All three of these, we're going to get into a lot more discussion next week. And so I'm hoping we'll look at these a little bit today, but they'll make more sense as we do a more advanced session. Now, initially open windows, we're telling it here that we want the header to show, and we might want a footer to show, and we might want the field list to open up again when we initially go into the report design. And we can modify this as we go into each design. So these are just generic defaults again that will happen when we create a brand new report. After the report or the design is started, we can go into these different areas within the design, and we can override the defaults if we need to. Okay. All right, so starting on page 11 here, we are going to go in and start building the sample report that we have on page 6 of your handout. So we have determined, the first thing we have to do is we have to tell it what records that we want to pull into this design. And we told our sample here on page 6 that we want the vendor and the invoice. This is an AP report. So to get started, we're going to go in under File, New Design at the top. The first thing it prompts us for is to select those records. So we're going to pick Invoice. I'm going to scroll down, and I'm going to pick vendor. And you see, like the sample in the book at the top of page 11, it selects those records for us over here on the records selected. If I made a mistake and I pulled something over here, I can unselect it just by clicking back on it. Now, one thing to point out, once you select your records and you click OK, those records are locked into this design. At that point, you cannot remove records that you've selected for a design. So if you pulled something in that you really don't need and you don't know it until you get the report fully designed, you have to run the report with that record available because you can't remove it. This is the only place where you can correct yourself, is right at the very beginning. Because once I say OK here, it's pulled that record in, and if you see, you'll see on the far right-hand side of your screen, it's given me a field list of all the fields within the record, the driving record, which is selected as AP invoice. That's at the very top of that field list. It's picked the record that has the most detail to be the driving record. And then what you see here on the left in this big, huge area, this is broken down into multiple parts. Okay, so you have a thick gray line here going across. This is what is separating the header. Everything above that thick gray line is the header. Everything below it is the body of the report. Now, up here in the header area, you'll see that you've got the company name has pulled in, a default title has pulled in, and it's going to do page numbers for us. And then you'll see here that there is a pink line here, and it's got a triangle in the corner. So everything underneath the company name and title of the report, between that and the pink line, anything that we put in that area is going to print. And we can drag this section down, so if we have a bunch of stuff we want to print up here in the header, we can put that in. We can put text in here, we can pull fields in here, and when we run the report, that information will print at the top of each page. Anything that you put below the pink line will not print when you print the report. So you might put notes in here about, what information is printing up at the tops, so that when you open this design back up in RD, you'll see that text displayed. But whatever's in here, keep in mind, this will not print on the report. All right, now everything down below here, again, is the body. Now I can move this up. I'm going to move this back up here. And then I can also move this gray area up. So I'm going to move it up. And then I can click my cursor back down here in the body just to make it just a little bit easier to read. All right, so in the body, this is where we're going to pull all the fields that we need going across the page to print this report. Before we start doing that, I want to talk to you about the view. All right, so we've got the view up here. We've got the, again, the field list. This is what's printing or displayed to us over here on the side. The header, we talked about this. This is on page 12 in your handout. The body, this big area here. And then footer, if I check that, it brings in the footer area. And so anything that we type in down here, again, is going to print on the report. If we need to put text in here, sorry, I pulled this down. I'm sorry, above the pink line again, up in here, this is going to print. Below the pink line for notes. Now the default is for this area not to come up. Most people do not put anything in the footer. So if you've got the footer coming up, you might take that off. That'll give you more room to build your report. Now, also back here on the header, if we go to File, Page Setup, and this is at the bottom of page 12, Page Headings. This is where we can control the information up here. So it's defaulted to use the heading. It's defaulted to use the system defaults, which are the fields here that are grayed out. So it'll pull system date, time, and all of that because we've checked it. That's why this is grayed. If I uncheck this, that opens up these fields, and I can actually, pull those in if I want. I can check mark them. I can also fix my title here. Call this okay. And it pulled that darn record security in here. I'm going to turn that off. It pulled the default formats for me. So I can when I this, watch what happens up here. Okay, so it pulled in my the new title that I gave it. Okay, and again, at the top of page 13, I've got some descriptions for those fields when you go to the page heading area again, underneath File, Page Setup, Page Headings. All right, so now we're ready to start building our report. So I'm going to put my cursor back over here on the edge because that's where I want it to start, where I'm going to start pulling information in. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull in I'm going to start with the vendor information. I've told it I want the vendor ID and the vendor name. So I'm going to double click on vendor, and you see that it pulls in here to the design. So this is different than Crystal. You're not dragging and dropping. You're highlighting the field that you want in the body of the report, and you're double clicking on it over here in this field list. So there's no drag and drop, and there's no typing of the field name itself. You have to double click to select it off of the field list. Now, the other thing I want is the vendor name. So to get to the vendor name, notice here I'm on the AP invoice. I want to get the name, which is over on the vendor record. So I'm going to click the index button here at the bottom, and I'm going to switch fields over here to the AP vendor. And I can highlight it and double click it, or I can highlight it and just click OK. And that brings me into the vendor record, where I can now highlight the vendor name and double click, and it pulls it in. All right, so now I'm going to come back a little bit later and bring in the address and the city-state zip information because I want to show you how to move stuff around, and that's a good example of that. So now I want to bring in the columns, the rest of the columns going across the page. I am going to maybe indent this a little bit, or maybe not, but I don't want it on the same line. I'm going to want the vendor ID and the vendor name to sort of print as an overlying type situation. So I might even come back over here and indent the invoice stuff in a little bit. So I'm putting my cursor where I want that first field to go, and I'm going to click my index button again, and I'm going to go back to the AP invoice. See here, I've changed my record, and I'm going to double click on the invoice number, and that pulls it in with the heading. Then I want to see the description. So I highlight the description field, again, double click, that pulls it in. Then I want the amount, so I'm going to double click, and that brings it in. And then I want the amount paid. Okay, so I'm going to double click to pull that in. Now, because of all the years that I've been doing this, I have an idea where all these records are located on these lists. For those of you that are new and you know the title of that field, instead of having to scroll up and down and search for it, down here at the bottom, you can actually change the order of this display and put it in alphabetical order. And then you can maybe more quickly find the fields that you're looking for. Okay. Okay. All right, so that's the kind of the basics of getting the information into the body of the report. Now let's pretend that we've decided now that we do want the address information to pull in here. So we haven't actually given it enough room here. So I'm going to kind of jump a little bit to page 16 where we talk about moving things around. So I can't just come in here and start putting address right in here because it's going to there's not enough room. It's going to run into this invoice field here. So I'm going to move this information down so I have enough space. So what I'm going to do to quickly move is I'm going to block this line out of the fields, and then I'm going to click into one of the fields, and you see how the screen changed? This allows me to drag this information down. So that gives me room in here that I can put the rest of my fields in. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to index back to vendor, and I'm going to grab address 1. And you'll see here, this is on page 14, that when I did that, I'm getting a message here that my column headings are in the way. Well, I don't need column headings for this address stuff that I'm putting in, so I'm going to tell it, leave the check mark here to remove the column headings, to retry it, and then it pulls that field in. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab city, and I get the same prompt here. And I'm going to grab state, same prompt, and I'm going to grab zip, same prompt. Actually, this is too close to state here. I don't like that. See how here? So again, I'm going to click on this field just by itself, and I'm going to move it over. So it gives it a little bit more space there. Okay, so now let's say that I put this information in and I want to get rid of it for whatever reason. So I can click on a field, or I can block a row of fields, and I can click the delete button on my keyboard. And it's going to tell me, is that what is that what you want? You want to clear out these fields? I can say okay. And then I can also block these out and hit delete, because that's not really where I'm going to put this information. And so it blocks or clears them out. And so now maybe I can add these back. Maybe I want these out a little bit farther. And I'm going to, again, go down one line here. I could have moved them, but I wanted to show you that you can block fields or groups of fields and click the delete key on your keyboard, and that will remove them from the design. I'm going to come back now to the AP invoice, and I'm going to grab, and actually I'm going to put this back in context order. I'm going to grab the invoice again. I'm going to grab the description again. I'm going to grab the amount, and I'm going to grab the amount paid. Okay. Now, let's just say that as I'm going through this, I realized on my design on page 6, I really need to see a date in here. I need to see the invoice date. And I've already built this report. I've already started building the report, and I want it to actually go in here in between two of these columns. So what I can do is I can highlight, I can block this out. I highlight what I want to move and then click and drag, and that lets me move the information. Or, put it back, I can draw a line on the screen starting where I want to do the move. And once I have that line drawn, you see this little icon up here at the top. It's got the line with the arrows pointing in both directions. If you click on that, it changes what I drew into a red line, and then I can move the fields to the right of that line, just back and forth. I can't move up and down. I can just move left and right, but I can't move past the dotted line. And then when I click the mouse again, it releases it. So now I can place my cursor here next to invoice, and I can double click on invoice date. Where are you? There you are, invoice date. And then if I want to move things back, again, draw my line, move back, and then click and release. Okay, so you can move left and right by drawing the line. You can block stuff out. If I did it with the block, I can actually move around. I don't have to go just left and right. I can move, and this is good if you need to move something out of the way to test something. You can do that. You can move it out of the way, put something into a column in the report, run a test, and then decide if it's not going to work. You can delete it, and then you can move the value back. So instead of deleting it, you just move it out of the way. Okay, so this is on page 16 in your handout. How to move things around. All right, so on page 17, let's talk about the processing record. So this is going to control the sort. This is done under design sort order. This is on page 17. Okay. This field here at the top where it says process all and it says AP invoices, this is the driving record. That matches up to what's over here over our column list. If you click the drop down, you'll see that our other choice is to be by vendor. So what that would mean is that all vendors would print regardless of whether they have invoices or not. If we leave it at AP invoices, only the vendors that have invoices are going to print. This is the key to that record. Now the default is key number 1, which is vendor invoice number. We can click the drop down and we can see other choices here. So these are the alternate keys that we have. So again, it's going to default to 1, which is the vendor invoice order. The other choice that we have here is to do a custom sort. Okay. And actually, I'm going to demonstrate this so that you can see what we're talking about as far as the let me cancel this. As far as this processing record is concerned. All right. I'm going to give this a test run here. Now, one couple of keys that you are going to, or icons up here that you're going to need to become very comfortable with. This is your save button. You need to click this every so often as you're designing, just in case something happens and you get booted out of the program. Nothing worse than having to spend an hour on a design and have somebody shut the machines down, shut the server off, and cut you off, and it wasn't saved. So you have to do it all over again. So click the Save button. I'm going to call this, we're going to call this RD class. Okay. So now I can see, here's my report name up here in the top, and it's been saved. And then this is your print option. So instead of having to go out to AP to run this design, I can run it from right here. Just click the print. I'm going to select the AP master file to run this against, and then I can do a print preview right here, and this is going to show me what my design looks like so far. All right. So here I've got vendor 100. It's listing all my invoices with dates, description, and amount. Okay. And it's only listing, let me zoom out here, it's only listing vendors that have invoices. If they don't have an invoice, they're not printing. Okay. And to prove that, we're going to go ahead and run this again. Let's see. In the design, Acme door and glass doesn't have anything, but let's see how many pages here. We've got 5. Let me find somebody that doesn't have any. Well, we'll find them actually when we run this again. All right, I'm going to cancel this, and I'm going to change the driving record here to be vendor. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this again. Okay, so we've got on this page, probably the sample data has got, oh, Crocker Electric and Welding. Look at that. We don't have an invoice. And it's not printing the vendor ID because I told it to grab the vendor ID from the invoice record. He doesn't have an invoice. So it's printing his vendor information okay, but no invoices. Okay. So that kind of demonstrates to you the importance of the sort order and this driving record. Now, there are some things at the top of page 19 that I wanted to talk about. Okay. Before we actually do, I'm going to do a custom sort here in a second. So the first thing at the very top of page 19, if you do a custom sort, it's going to take your report longer to run. So make sure that you double check these alternate keys. Because if your custom sort matches up to one of these alternate keys, use it instead, and then the report doesn't have to stop and think and rearrange the information to print on the report. So think about that when you think you need a custom sort other than the one that comes up as the default. The other things that you need to consider is that the sort order is going to determine what you can total by, what you can summarize by, how you can assign the line spacing, how you can control your page breaks, and your print controls. And if you're having to do any ASUM functions in the formula area, it's going to determine where you can accumulate to, what level. Okay. So if let's say we were doing this report off of the distribution, the AP distribution record, and you wanted to sort this and break for totals by the GL account number, you would have to do a custom sort and add that field into the sort in order to be able to get a subtotal by that GL account. So what I'm trying to say is when you go to assign the totals, if the field that you need to total by is not on the list, you need to change your sort, and you potentially will have to do a custom sort to get that field to be available to you for totaling. All right. So let's say here we need to change this. We need a custom sort because we want this to print by vendor name. We want it sorted by name. So I'm going to index here over to the vendor, and I'm going to grab the name. By double-clicking, you see it pulls it over here onto the left. And then within the vendor name, I want it to sort by invoice. So it's going to print that way instead. All right. Now, a couple things to notice about this. Okay, as you select your records, they're moved over here to the left-hand side of the screen. If you make a mistake and you need to change the order, you have to use this button here at the bottom, Erase Last, to move up and to where you need to make the change, and then build from there down again. Okay. You can't insert or change. Oops, see there? You can't insert or change something that's on this list. So the only thing I can change about this is whether I want this to be an ascending, starting with A, or descending, starting with Z. Let me get the invoice back in there. Okay. Index here, this is what I use to switch records to pull my fields. Order, again, I can put this in alphabetical order. If I'm looking for a specific field and I don't know where it's located within the software, I can get the list to show in alphabetical order. And then just click OK once you're ready. Okay, so now we can see it's going to print in name invoice order. And look at the button for custom sort. That has asterisks around it. That's how you can tell that there is a custom sort set up here. If there's no little X's or asterisks around the custom sort button, that means that it's not using a custom sort. It's using either the primary key or an alternate key. All right, so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a save here. Notice my RD class here at the top. It's got a little asterisk after it. That means I've made changes to the design. Once I hit the save button, the asterisk goes away. It's been saved. So I'm going to go ahead and print again. And now we are in alphabetical order. Now it's kind of changed up a little bit here too. Let's see. We're getting all of this information repeated. Okay, so the A1 is followed by AAA, and then A drywall. So it's not in vendor ID order anymore. I'm going to close that. Now, by making that change, I changed how often these fields are going to print. So let's talk about, I'm going to skip here to page 22. We're going to talk about print controls. I'm going to change my view here to print controls instead of normal. So you see how normal everything is in black. Once I do print controls, it's still in black, but I'm able to see by clicking on a field how often this is going to print. It's been set to print once per invoice record, but that's not what I want. I only want this to print once, this set of fields right here to print once per name. So I'm going to actually block this out. And then I'm going to click down here. Do you see where it says at the bottom of this window, it says print once per. If I click into that line, I can see, because invoice is the driving record, that's why it's printing once per invoice record. I'm going to change that to say print once per name. And I click OK, and now this block is a different color versus these down here that are going to print once per invoice. So now let me save that. I'm going to print this again. Now I get what I really want. I want this information to only print once, but it's listing all of my vendors for me. Okay. So that's what print controls do. And depending on your sort order or your custom sort, it's very tied to this print control option. All right, let's go back to page 20, and let's talk about formatting fields. So as you add the information or add the fields to the report, it's going to pull in default format information. So as an example, all of these are, basically text fields. If you double click on the field itself, you'll see that you'll see information about that field, like its length, the justification, and whether or not it's going to abbreviate. So anything that the system considers to be alpha is that way. If it's considered to be a name field, you'll see a name screen come up. This is mostly more valid for payroll. So here's where you can, break out first and last names, but this only works if you've got the semicolon in the name field itself. The rest of these fields are the same here. So we've got address, we've got city, okay. State and zip are the same. Invoice number, same. It's considered an alpha field. Date is different. Okay. Now it defaults to the default format, which is month, day, year. If you want to change that, uncheck the checkbox, and then you're able to select a different format. Just scroll down the list and find the type that you want. Okay. Description again, that is alpha. Amount. So it pulls in the default values for the amount field. Signed, whether it's going to print a minus sign if it's negative. Commas, if it's over, $999. Do you want this field to total? By default, it will. The length, the number of decimals will default. The justification will default. Rounding will default to round. The fill option means if it's 0, it'll be blank, or you could fill it with asterisks or with zeros. Okay. On all of these, if you've got a lot of information going across the page, you may run out of space. 225, I think, is the limit, somewhere around there, of characters going across. So if you are, to the end of the design and you've run out of room, what you'll need to do is come back in the design and reduce some of these fields. So what you could do, you can either do it this way by double-clicking on the field, but sometimes what's easier is if you click on the field and then grab the edge with your cursor, and you can drag it, and you can shorten it up. And then you could move this one over, and again, grab the edge and shorten it up. You also have to pay attention to your headings. So if you reduce the size of the field, make sure that your headings are still lining up over the fields themselves. That's one way to do it. You can also, again, double-click and say, okay, I don't need 30 characters. Maybe I only need 25. So I can shrink that up, and then again, use your move option, use the slider, and move stuff over. That gives you more room here on the right-hand side to add more to the design. Okay, the print controls again are on page 22 and 23, and I think we're looking good right here so far. And I did the example that's on page 24. So let's now switch to page 25, and let's talk about our totals. I'm going to go ahead and click my Save button here. I'm going to go to Design Totals at the top. Okay. By default, it didn't assign any totals for us. Usually I want to be in control of that. So plus, it helps if those total lines are not in the body of the design while you're trying to build the design. They can get in the way. So if I want to say, okay, here for total levels, I want it to print report totals, and I want a total for each vendor. And then for the summarization, I'm not going to summarize. This is a one line per invoice design anyway. I don't need to summarize. But if I was in a situation where I had maybe multiple distribution lines, and I want it to just give me a grand total for a specific job, I might be able to use one of these summarize areas to shrink the amount of detail that's going to print. So for now, though, I'm just going to go with report totals and name total. So let me pull that in, and you see here it's pulled in the down total for me. It's got the description for the report total all the way over here on the left. I'm going to drag that over here so it's closer. And then I'm going to give it a title here. Maybe move that over so it lines up. And then notice our colors here. So this color matches the color up here for the print control by vendor name. This blue is bright blue is the report total at the bottom or at the end. So I'm going to go ahead here. I'm going to save this again and let me run it. So now I'm seeing totals at the bottom of each vendor name. And if I go to the end, I now have a report total at the end. Now, a tip. If you need to change your sort order, maybe you've got the report done, you've added the totals, you ran it, and then you realize, oh, darn, I need to sort it slightly different and maybe pull in another field in the sort. If you've already pulled the totals in, go back to Design Totals and take those off, because it messes up the sort and the totals will be incorrect. So if you uncheck the boxes that you have marked for total levels, then you can change your sort order and come back then and reassign the total options. Okay, line spacing. Design line spacing. And again, this is determined by your sort order. Notice that it's only asking me about the vendor and the invoices. So it has already determined that I should double space between the vendor names and then single space for the invoices, which actually looks pretty good. That's actually what I want. Sometimes when you do a test print, you're going to have double spaces where you don't want them. So first thing I would do is come in here and change wherever the double space is happening, change that to single. Group page breaks. Defaults to no page breaks, meaning it's going to run the report and it's just going to go from, list all the vendors together, starting on page 1 and going down. It doesn't break for a new page. The unconditional page break means it's only going to print vendors on a page by themselves, meaning every time the name changes, I want it to go to a new page. So I get all of A1 Electric on one page, all of AAA on one page, and then if it needs to go to more than one page, when it breaks, I want it to start over with page 1. I'm going to tear these apart. I'm going to hand them out. Maybe I'm going to send them to the vendor. I don't want them to see that they're page 20 out of 50. I want them to see their stuff start on page 1. Okay, we're going to come back here in a second for the conditional. Let's take a look at how that works. All right. So we see here vendor 100, A1 Electric, is all that's on this page. Vendor AAA is all on one page. And page number here is starting at 1, so Ace Drywall. That's all that's on this page. Now, if I have a vendor that has more information that will fit on one page, what I might say here is if, I'm going to set this back to no conditional page break, and I'm going to say conditional page break by vendor name. And what that means is as it's printing the report, it's going to fill up the page with all the vendors that can fit on that page. When it gets to the bottom, if the next vendor will not all fit on that page, it's going to bump them to the next page. That's what it means here. Start on a new page only when it doesn't fit, meaning it doesn't fit on the current page that we're printing. So let's see what happens if I switch it to that, and we'll run it. Okay, so here we've got, let's get to the bottom of this page. This is all fitting. We didn't have any more room there. Let's see what happens when we get here. A lot of these vendors have just enough to fit. Okay. Well, this one here, let's go back. This one didn't fit at the bottom. So notice he only has one, but there wasn't enough room here to fit all of his information. So that's why it moved him to the next page. So, and again, here's a big area right here. So all this space, this guy here, Kingston Plumbing, wouldn't fit. So that's why it broke for the new page after Jackson Heating. Even though there's a bunch of space here, it wasn't enough room to fit all of this. So that's what unconditional means. That can be kind of confusing. Most people will go with this one, with the unconditional page break, and put people on a page by themselves. That's the most common. Okay, let's talk about next. Let's talk about conditions here. So we had a condition for this report. We only want subcontractor vendors only to print. So if we go back to design and we come down here to conditions, and we can say, let's go back over to the vendor, and we're going to scroll down and we're going to grab type. And we're going to say equal to subcontractor. So the way the condition window works is you select a field off the field list. Then you select an operator in the middle, meaning equal to, not equal to, and so on. You select one of these bullets that you're going to use to compare that field against the value with. So I'm going to say I want the type on the vendor record to be equal to subcontractor. And I'm going to click OK to that. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and save it. I'm going to go ahead and run this. And now I only get subcontractors to print. So let's see. Yeah, AA is gone. So let me change our page break here. Back. Let's try it again. I want to show you here. Okay, so we only have 2 pages. So it stripped some people out. AAA is gone. They're not a subcontractor. So I'm only getting a certain type of vendor on this report. The other thing, what I might do is, if an invoice is fully paid, maybe I don't need to see, like these 2 invoices here, the drywall supplies. Those are paid. Maybe all I want to see are open invoices. I can add another condition in here. I can use my add button right here, and I'm going to say that the status is equal to open. Now, up here at the top, this is where you need to give this some thought. If you are going to do multiple conditions, and means that the record has to pass both conditions. They have to be a subcontractor and the status has to be open. The or means you have to pass one or the other or both. Okay? You don't have to pass both, but you can. But the minimum is you have to pass one or the other condition in order to print on the report. If we're going to say they have to pass both, so we're going to leave this at and. I'm going to OK that. Let's print this again. And now you'll see that all of my fully paid invoices are gone. Only the open ones are left. Now you can, as you run the report, if you want to override the condition, this conditions button is here, and you can delete or add or change what's already there just for that run of the report. Once you cancel out of here, that condition is reverted back to what's stored in the design. Now the other thing I want to point out also here, when you're doing multiple conditions, you need to be careful of the order that you put the conditions in. When you first open this up, notice that it defaults or highlights that very first line. If I click Add, it's going to put the condition in between these 2. If I need to add the condition to the bottom of the list, be sure you click on the last one at the bottom. And also, if you're mixing ands and ors together, because they don't all have to be and or all have to be ors. In some cases in the design, there needs to be an and piece to it along with an or. And sometimes if these things are not in the right order when you run the report, either what you're looking for doesn't show up or what you don't want on the report does. And so the first thing to look at is the order that these conditions are in, to make sure that, if you change, maybe if you tweak it by changing them around, change the order on the list around, it might work better. And unfortunately, what you have to do is you have to delete. You might have to delete from the bottom up and then rebuild it from going down, depending on how many conditions that you have there. Okay. All right, so a couple of little cosmetic things that I'm going to do here too is because I like to make things, even though RD is not a fancy report writer, but you can draw lines. So I'm using the dash here, and I'm going to draw a line here. So this looks a little bit better. And then also after the invoices list, I want to separate them from the vendor total. So I'm going to use the equal sign and go across like that. So now if I print this, that looks a little bit better. Sometimes the display doesn't draw the line all the way across. You'll have to look at it when you actually print to the printer. But that looks a little bit better. Okay. And then the other thing, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add, even though it's not in your handout, we have a final column here for balance. So I'm going to go ahead and just really quickly here, since we have time, I'm going to go into Tools, Formulas. So this is in the Design Formula area, and I'm going to create a new formula, and I'm going to say Amount minus Amount Paid. So you have to double-click again on the fields to pull them into the formula. Then I typed the minus sign, and then I double-clicked on Amount Paid. And I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to call this, our heading for this is Balance. Okay. And then I'm going to close, and then I'm going to use my index button again, and I'm going to go to Design Formulas. And when I go there, there's my balance field, and I'm going to add this right here. And I'm going to extend my line here. Maybe draw it a little farther out. Extend my equal signs. Maybe draw that out a little farther. Oh, now it's way out. It's a screen display. But now I've got a balance here, so I can see what's left on each invoice for payment. All right. All right, so that brings us to the end of our basic session. We've got a lot more to cover in some of the areas in our advanced session next week under session 2. But I've got some tips and reminders here that I want to kind of go back over with you before I let you go. The first reminder, if things are not totaling the way you want or not printing in the order that you want, the first thing to look at is your sort order. That order does more than just control the order. It's controlling your totaling, your accumulations, your print controls, right? So it's not just the order that information is going to print in. So that's the first thing I would probably look at. If you're not able to total like you want or control how often something prints on the report, then look at your sort order. The first tip there, again, draw out what you want before you start. Meet with the people who want the report. Draw it on paper so that you have it in front of you. Fill in, before you even get started, fill in the records that you need to pull in, the field names that you need to pull in, how you want it totaled, if there's conditions that you're going to need or formulas that you're going to need. Remember that each record has at least one key. A lot of them have multiple keys. So if they're asking for something to sort differently, look at those alternate keys to see if a sort is already built in there for you, instead of you having to design a custom sort. Start a binder with printouts of these records that you're using. It's a lot easier to look at the fields within those records on paper than to try to look by looking at the available fields printout. If you're going to be pulling reports out of a certain application a lot, it would be a big help for you to have a binder with what those fields are. And then lastly, click that Save button. I've been burned multiple times, especially in the really complicated designs. If you've got a really complicated, maybe a union report or a job cost report, and you have built a lot of formulas into that design, every once in a while, RD will get to a certain point where it can't handle anymore, and it will actually throw you out of RD. If you haven't hit your Save button, you lose all of that. And trust me, I've cried a few times. So click that Save button multiple times, because as soon as you come out, you can go right back in, and all of your stuff is still there. The other one that's not on this list is if you're taking one of the standard Sage reports and modifying it for your company, make a copy so that it doesn't get overridden if someone has to restore a report folder. And even maybe save your custom reports in a custom folder, or even save them in your own company folder. So again, if that report folder that comes from Sage gets overridden, you're not losing your report designs. Okay. All right, so we have a few minutes here. If anybody has any questions right now that you'd like to ask, if you want to type those into the chat area, then Tina can read those out to me, and I'll be happy to answer your questions now. If you have anything that you thought of during the session, or if there's anything that you want me to go back to and explain again, I would be very happy to do that for you.
Not really seeing any questions yet, Jeanette. Everyone's looks like you did a pretty good job this time. You always do. You always do.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, if you guys come, join us for our session next week, we're going to jump into those print controls and conditional printing, more formulas. We're going to expand on the report that we designed today, and do some things to it that you might not be aware that you can do.
No, looking pretty good. Guess.
Okay. All right. Well, I think then, if you think of something later, please email Tina, and she will forward that to me. And again, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you have about Report Writer. Just keep in mind, anything that you key into Sage, in a field, in a record, in a field, anywhere in the software, you can pull that out into a report. It doesn't hurt anything when you do that. You can even, like, we're going to be doing formulas and functions next week. It doesn't change any of the data when you do that. You're just, getting a result onto paper or into a print file that you need. Somebody's asking for that information. Okay. So thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you next week. Thanks, Tina.